in as United States Senator from New York in January of 2009. Prior to her service in the Senate, Gillabrand served in the U.S. House of Representatives, represented New York's 20th Congressional District, which spans 10 counties in upstate New York. Adriana Rubertone wrote Senator Gillabrand requesting that she address our 2013 American Legion Auxiliary Program today. At this time, please rise to welcome Senator Gillabrand, who will be escorted by Adriana.
Now a senior at the North Shore High School in Glen Head, sent a letter to my Senate office asking that I attend your conference. I couldn't be more excited to be here today to talk to all of you, the young women who will decide what the future of our country and world will look like and who will lead the way. I'm grateful for Adriana because she showed courage and she showed enormous determination to be able to bring me here to meet you all today. And having that idea and stick-to-itiveness really makes the difference in accomplishing anything you set your mind to. So thank you, Adriana, for being so bold. So I've come to ask you all a question today. How are all of you going to learn and use the lessons that you are going to learn here at Girls State to make a difference? How are you going to pick up where the women who came before you and before all of us left off? I hope that each and every one of you will find a way to participate in public service, that you will find a way to make that difference in someone else's life. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I found my path to public service. I grew up in Albany, not that far from here, in a family where I had a very strong role model. That role model was my grandmother. Now, some 75 years ago, she was a young woman who never went to college, who worked in our state legislature. She was a secretary, and she had the notion that she wanted to get involved in the political debate. She wanted to have a role and she wanted to have a say. So she decided that the best way to do that was not to speak in just one voice, but to speak with many voices, speaking alongside hers. So she decided to engage the other women of the legislature. She asked all the women who worked with her there to get involved in politics. They asked all the women in their community to get involved in politics. And the more they got involved, the bigger difference they made. Over the next 50 years, those women worked on every campaign, every fall, trying to make sure the person who got elected shared their values and shared their priorities. They were the women that did all the work it takes to get elected. All the door-to-door work, all the envelope stuffing, all the phone banking. But they worked hard because they knew they could make a difference. What I learned from my grandmother were a few very important things. Number one, that women's voices matter. Number two, that grassroots activism matters. And number three, what you do with your time matters. After college and law school, I was working as a young lawyer in a big city firm in New York City, and I remember watching our then First Lady, Hillary Clinton, go to China. Now it was 1995, and as our First Lady, she was giving a speech from Beijing about women's rights. She got up on a stage and she said, "Women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights." And that statement was so profound. And I knew how important it was because I had been an Asian Studies major at Dartmouth. I had studied in Beijing. I learned to speak Mandarin. I traveled all across China. And I knew that in China, they were still killing girl babies in the countryside. And I thought, what an incredible message for our First Lady to be delivering at that place and at that time. I felt that I had to get involved in politics. I thought, if I was ever going to be at that conference, I would only be there if I was involved in politics. And that's what got me started. So naturally, I followed in my grandmother's footsteps, and I started working on campaigns. I started organizing other women to also work on campaigns and to do the tough work it takes to elect somebody that you believe in, who represents your values. As a young lawyer, I decided I really thought my path was not in the law, that it would be in public service. So I tried all sorts of ways to do public service. But something you'll find in your own life is true. Sometimes the way forward is not always clear. The first effort I made was to work at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern and the Southern Districts of New York. I didn't get those jobs. Then I thought, well, I'll try to work for one of the major charities. I applied to the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, the Rockefeller Foundation. I didn't even get an interview. Then I went to an event that our now governor was speaking at. Andrew Cuomo was giving a speech about public service and why it was important to be involved. And I had been trying to get involved for some time now. So I walked up to him and said, well, Mr. Secretary, it's not so easy to get from A to B. I don't know how to do public service. And he simply said, well, will you move to Washington? Now, as a young lawyer living in New York City, moving to Washington was a fairly daunting request. But I, of course, said yes. And I interviewed for the job. A few days later, I got the job, and I took the job. 2 weeks later, I found myself living in Washington, D.C., and working for Secretary Cuomo as his legal counsel. Now, the more I worked in public service, the more I loved it. And this was at the end of the Clinton administration. There was only about 7 months left. And they had an election, and the Democrats did not win that election. So there were no more appointed jobs. I couldn't stay in my current job. So I had to think about, how can I serve if I'm not in this job? And the more I thought about it, and the more I really spent some time thinking about the difference I could make, I decided to run for office. Now, the way was not clear again. I called a friend of mine who was a pollster, and I told him that I wanted to run for office from where I was from. I wanted to be able to move back home and run from this district. And he looked at this district, and he told me that it would be very difficult to win. He said, in fact, Kirsten, you can't win. And I said, but why can't I win? He said, well, you can't win because you're running as a Democrat, and the district is 2-1 Republican. I said, well, what happens if I run the perfect campaign? Clearly, I could win that. He said, Kirsten, there are more cows than Democrats in the district. I don't think you can win. Well, we decided to run anyway, and we worked really hard. We got the message out. We raised a lot of money, and it made a difference. We won that election by 6 points. We ran again for re-election 2 years later, and we won that election by 24 points. So the more I worked at it, the better and better we did, making sure that people understood that I was there to serve them. I focused on transparency and accountability. I spent a lot of time in my community doing Congress at your corner, and the reality was is people really liked meeting their member of Congress. They liked to know what I cared about, what I was working on, what I thought was important, and they wanted to tell me directly what was important to them, what they wanted me to work on, what they thought were their highest priorities. And that was something that made a difference to them. So now you've heard my story about how I got started. What's much more interesting for me, though, is your story. I want to know how you are going to get started, how you are going to get involved, and how you are going to make a difference. And the reason why your voice is so important is because every day in Washington, decisions are being made. And if you're not part of that debate, you may not like the outcome of those decisions. So I think your voice is absolutely essential. And one of the things I've been working on is trying to make sure more women's voices are heard. We need to make sure that more women all across this country are voting. We need to make sure that more women are being advocates for the things that they care most about, so that they can set the national agenda. Women's leadership is not as well represented as it should be. I don't know if you realize this, But 25 years ago, there were only 2 women in the U.S. Senate. Today, there are only 20 women in the U.S. Senate. In 25 years, to go from 2 to 20 is not very good. Frankly, it's pathetic. We need to do more, and we need to do better. In corporate America, we have not achieved the leadership level that we need to make sure our economy is working better. We only have 3 women who are CEOs, 3% of women who are CEOs in Fortune 500 companies. 20 years ago, it was even smaller. We only have 16% women who are on Fortune 500 boards. But when women are on these boards, all the studies show the returns on investment and the returns on equity are all higher. Now, you might not understand this term of art, but when there's at least 1 woman on a corporate board, they are 40% less likely to have to restate their earnings. Do you know what that means? It means 40% less likely you have to admit that you screwed up your earnings in the first place. So what that tells you is that women make a difference when they are in these decision-making roles. So I hope that each and every one of you will decide to make a difference, whether it's in public service, whether it's helping us help the economy grow. Women's voices make the difference. The issues that you care about make a difference. The issues that you bring to the table and the way you solve problems makes a difference. So please, make sure your voice is heard. And when you are met with someone saying you can't make a difference, or saying you can't change the status quo, that's when you know you are on the right track. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions.